The Eastern Front in 1942 was not a place for men. It was a place for monsters, steel beasts, firestorms, and endless death. Inside one of those beasts sat Sergeant Otto Keller, a man of 30. His hair already flecked with gray, though he was barely older than his crew. His hands were calloused, his eyes dark and sharp, from years of squinting through optics and smoke. His Panzer IV was home and coffin both. 4 men made it live: Hans Vogel, the driver, quiet, methodical, his hands steady on the levers. He had driven farm wagons in Bavaria before the war, and now he drove 30 tons of steel across Russia. Kurt Weiss, the gunner, young, reckless, his laughter always too loud, his eyes always searching for targets. He had a natural feel for the gun, as if born with crosshairs in his eyes. Dieter Brandt, the loader, big, broad-shouldered, sweat pouring even in winter. He could lift shells like firewood, his arms like pistons shoving steel into the breech again and again, and Otto himself, the commander, who bore the weight of each decision, each order that kept them alive another hour. They had fought in France, rolled through Belgium, and driven across the Balkans, but nothing compared to Russia. Here, the land itself seemed to hate them. The Panzer rattled forward on a track that was more mud than road, the suspension groaning with every dip. The summer air was heavy with the smell of dust, manure, and smoke from villages long since burned. Hans hunched over the levers, his voice muffled through the driver's throat-piece. "Road's worse than yesterday. We'll throw a track if this keeps up," Kurt smirked from behind the sight of the cannon. "You worry too much. A little mud never killed a Panzer," Dieter snorted, wiping sweat from his brow as he stacked shells inside their racks. "No, but the Russians will. I'd rather fight mud than Ivan." Otto didn't reply. He kept his binoculars pressed to his face, scanning every tree line, every broken farmhouse, every suspicious shadow. Out here, silence meant nothing. Out here, ambush could come from anywhere. The countryside was a graveyard. Fields, once golden with wheat, now lay blackened, churned to mud by treads. The skeletons of villages stood like broken teeth. Chimneys without houses, walls half collapsed, wells poisoned. Here and there, bodies lay by the roadside, both German and Soviet. Some had been dead for days, their faces already pale and bloated under the summer flies. Horses lay twisted in their harnesses, carts splintered beside them. No one spoke as they passed. The only sound was the clatter of the Panzer's treads, the growl of its Maybach engine, and the occasional cough from the exhaust. Inside the Panzer, time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. The crew lived in a world of metal. The clank of gears, the stink of oil, the constant vibration that rattled their bones. Kurt tapped the side of the gun impatiently. "Too quiet." "I don't like it," Hans grunted. "You never like it. When it's quiet, you think Ivan's waiting. When it's loud, you think Ivan's already here." "I'd rather it be loud," Kurt muttered. "At least then I can shoot something," Dieter chuckled, his deep voice filling the cramped hull. "You just like watching things blow up. Better them than us." Otto finally spoke, his tone sharp. "Enough chatter." Eyes open, they fell silent. Even Dieter's humming stopped. It came as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road. They were passing a burned-out farmhouse when the world erupted. A Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun fired from the tree line. The shell screamed across the road, so close Otto felt the Panzer shudder as it passed. Behind them, a half-track exploded in fire, men tumbling from its wreck like rag dolls. "Gun, left side!" Otto barked. Kurt swung the turret, eyes wide, searching for the muzzle flash. "There, by the house!" Dieter slammed a shell into the breech. "Up!" the Panzer's 75mm roared. The farmhouse vanished in a thunderclap, splinters and stone raining across the field. The Soviet gun was blown to pieces, its crew flung like dolls. But more fire followed. Mortars whistled overhead, bursting in the fields. Rifles cracked from the trees. Tracer fire danced across the hull, sparks flying. It was an ambush. "Drive! Forward!" Otto shouted. Hans jammed the throttle. The Panzer lurched, its treads chewing through mud and fire. To stop was death. To charge was the only hope. Soviet infantry broke from cover, Molotovs in hand. One bottle smashed against the hull, flames licking the armor. The tank shook as Hans swerved, plowing through the fire. Kurt fired again, and again. Each shot tore apart trenches, gun pits, men diving for cover. The recoil slammed through the hull, the smell of burnt powder choking them. Dieter's muscles burned as he fed shell after shell into the breach, his arms slick with sweat. His ears rang with every shot, but his hands never stopped. "Keep going," Otto barked, his voice iron. "Don't stop for anything." The Panzer became a beast, tearing through fences, smashing walls, belching smoke and fire from its gun. The bow machine gun rattled, cutting down shadows as they darted through the fields. The world outside was chaos. Fire, blood, screaming men. But inside the Panzer, there was only the rhythm of survival. Spot, load, fire, repeat. Minutes stretched like hours, until at last the tree line fell silent. The mortars stopped. The rifles faded. The Soviets melted back into the woods, leaving behind only smoke and ruin. Hans slowed the Panzer, its engine groaning, the treads black with soot and blood. Inside, the crew sat in stunned silence, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding. Kurt exhaled shakily, his hand trembling on the gun. "We should be dead." Hans's knuckles were white on the levers. "But we're not." Dieter leaned back, sweat pouring down his face. "Not today." Otto lowered his binoculars. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold. He stared at the wrecked tree line, the broken bodies, the smoking ruins. "This is the Eastern Front," he said quietly, "and it's only the beginning." By late November 1942, the world had turned white. Snow blanketed the Russian steppe as far as the eye could see. The once muddy roads were now frozen rivers of ice, every rut and track hardened into steel. The Panzer IV's Maybach engine coughed and rattled in the cold, its exhaust hissing into the frigid air. Inside, the crew huddled in their coats, breath steaming in the cramped steel tomb. The walls of the Panzer were ice cold, frost forming on bolts and levers. Hans cursed under his breath as he worked the frozen controls. "This isn't driving anymore. It's wrestling." Kurt blew into his hands, his gloves stiff with cold. "Better than walking. Infantry freeze on the march. At least we've got steel around us." Dieter sat on an ammunition crate, rubbing his hands together. "Steel doesn't warm you when it's 20 below. I can't feel my bloody fingers anymore." Otto sat perched in his commander's cupola, binoculars scanning the white horizon. His voice was low, calm, but edged with unease. "Stop complaining. Cold doesn't kill half as quick as Ivan does." But they all knew the truth. The Russian winter was an enemy of its own. The landscape was dead quiet, muffled by snow. The only sound was the grind of the Panzer's treads and the occasional caw of a crow circling overhead. Villages they passed were husks, their wooden houses collapsed under snow, their wells frozen solid. No smoke rose from chimneys. No animals stirred, only silence. Kurt muttered uneasily, "Too quiet." Hans smirked without humor. "You always say that." "This time I mean it," Kurt replied. "Snow hides everything. Guns, trenches, even men." Dieter's deep voice rumbled in the gloom. "And when they fire, we'll never hear it coming." Otto said nothing. His eyes scanned the tree lines, the gullies, the snowdrifts that could hide anything. He'd been fighting long enough to know when death was waiting, and death was near. It came in the early afternoon, when the sun was little more than a pale disk in the gray sky. The Panzer was crawling along a snow-choked road when the first shell screamed in. It struck the ground just meters ahead, showering them with ice and dirt. "Ambush!" Otto roared. Another shell smashed into the half-track behind them, flipping it on its side in a spray of fire and snow. Men tumbled from its wreck, screaming as machine gun fire cut them down. Hans yanked the levers, slewing the Panzer sideways as Kurt swung the turret. "There!" Kurt shouted. "Guns in the tree line!" Dieter was already slamming a shell into the breach. "Up!" The 75mm barked, fire belching from the barrel. The shell tore into the snowy tree line. a Soviet anti-tank gun exploding in a blast of wood and flame. But others fired back. Shells clanged against their armor, one glancing off the turret with a shriek of steel, another smashing into the side skirt, rattling the entire hull. They were in the kill zone. Hans gunned the throttle, the Panzer plowing through snowbanks. Tracer fire zipped across the road, hissing like angry hornets. Soviet infantry darted from cover, rifles flashing, grenades in hand. A Molotov shattered against the hull, flames licking the side. Smoke poured into the vents, choking the crew. "Fire extinguisher!" Otto barked. Dieter grabbed the nozzle, spraying foam through the hatch. The flames hissed and died, leaving blackened scars on the armor. "Guns ready!" Kurt shouted. Otto pointed. "That gun pit! Take it out!" The Panzer's cannon roared again, smashing a trench line into splinters. Soviet soldiers flew through the air, their rifles spinning into the snow. Hans swerved the tank through the chaos, treads crushing bodies beneath them, the engine howling as he pushed it harder than it wanted to go. The Soviets fought like demons. From the trees, from dugouts hidden under snow, they came in waves, wrapped in white camouflage, ghosts against the whiteness. Their rifles cracked, their machine guns rattled, their mortars dropped shells with deadly precision. One Soviet soldier darted from cover, a satchel charge in hand. He sprinted straight at the Panzer, leaping onto the side. "On the hull!" Dieter shouted. Hans swerved violently, slamming the man against a tree. His body broke with a crunch, the charge tumbling harmlessly into the snow. But more came, their faces twisted with hate, their cries carrying even over the roar of engines and guns. Kurt's voice cracked over the intercom. "They don't care if they die, they just keep coming." Otto's voice was grim. "That's the Red Army, and this is their land. Remember that." For minutes that felt like hours, they fought through the storm. Shell after shell, burst after burst, until the smoke cleared and the Soviets began to pull back. The tree line was shattered, bodies littering the snow, guns twisted and burning. The white ground was stained red. Hans slowed the Panzer, its engine smoking, its treads black with blood and fire. Inside, the crew sat gasping, their ears ringing, their faces pale. Kurt leaned back from the gun sight, his hands trembling. "Mother of God, how are we still alive?" Dieter's chest heaved as he slumped against the shells. "Luck, just luck." Hans stared ahead, jaw tight. "Luck runs out." Otto said nothing. He lowered his binoculars, scanning the ruined tree line. His eyes were hollow, his face drawn. He knew Hans was right. By dusk they reached a shattered village, its huts roofless, its wells frozen. They parked the Panzer beside a burned-out church, its bell tower broken in half. Inside, they huddled around a small fire, their faces lit by the flickering glow. Outside, the wind howled, snow whipping across the ruins. Dieter held his hands out to the flames, muttering, "Better to burn than freeze." Kurt cleaned his pistol in silence, his eyes still wide, haunted. Hans sat apart, staring at nothing. "They'll come again. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tonight." Otto leaned against the frozen wall, his eyes never leaving the dark horizon. "They will," he said quietly, "and we'll be ready. Because we don't have a choice." They didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every creak of the wind, every howl of a wolf in the distance, every snap of the fire made them reach for their weapons. The Panzer loomed outside, its steel cold, its engine silent. A beast at rest, waiting for the next call to war. Inside, the crew sat in silence, each man lost in his thoughts. Memories of home. Memories of friends already buried under snow. The Eastern Front had only just begun, and already it was devouring them piece by piece. The snow had not stopped falling when the new orders arrived. A dispatch rider, his motorcycle sputtering in the cold, delivered the message to Otto's company. Advance through the forest. Secure the road beyond. Expect resistance. It was madness. The forest ahead was dense, its trees black skeletons clawing into the sky, the snow lying deep and untouched. Perfect ground for an ambush. Otto Keller read the orders twice, then folded the paper into his coat. His crew watched him in silence inside the Panzer, their breath fogging the air. Hans finally asked, voice flat, "So, straight into the trees? They want us to drive into a coffin?" Kurt smirked without humor, fingers tapping the barrel of his pistol. "Better than freezing here. At least we'll die warm." Dieter shook his head. "You're insane." Otto's voice cut through the gloom. "Enough. We go where we're told. That's the war. Get ready." None argued further. They all knew arguing changed nothing. The Panzer IV rolled forward, its engine growling in protest as it nosed into the tree line. Branches scraped against the armor. Snow showered down onto the hull. The road became little more than a track, rutted and narrow, hemmed in by trees on both sides. Visibility shrank to almost nothing. Otto sat in the cupola, binoculars raised, but he could see only darkness and snow. Every shadow looked like a rifle. Every tree might hide a gun. Hans cursed under his breath, his gloved hands stiff on the levers. "One shell here and we're finished. No room to maneuver," Otto agreed silently. He knew it was suicide ground. Kurt peered through the gun sight, his voice tight. "If they're here, they're watching us right now." The silence broke with the sharp crack of a rifle, then another. Bullets pinged harmlessly against the armor, sparking off the steel. "Infantry!" Dieter barked. Figures in white camouflage darted between trees, rifles flashing, grenades in hand. The bow machine gun rattled, spitting tracers into the snow, cutting down the first wave. But then the deeper sound came, a hollow boom that echoed through the woods. "Anti-tank gun!" Otto shouted. The shell slammed into the ground just short of their track, snow erupting like a fountain. Hans swore and swung the Panzer sideways, the treads chewing into the frozen ground. "Target left!" Otto snapped. Kurt's turret swung, eyes straining through smoke and branches. He fired. The 75mm roared, the blast shaking the trees. A hidden bunker exploded in a shower of snow and timber, the Soviet gun crew vanishing in the blast. But more fire came from the right. Another gun, another flash. The shell screamed in, smashing against their side skirt with a metallic shriek that rattled every bone inside. "Hit, but no penetration," Dieter shouted, gripping the shells. "Find it!" Otto barked. "Now!" The forest erupted. Soviet infantry swarmed like wolves, pouring fire into the Panzer, their cries echoing through the trees. Molotovs arced through the air, smashing against the hull, flames licking across the armor. Hans pushed the tank forward, crushing logs and bodies alike. The engine roared, the exhaust belched smoke. The Panzer clawed deeper into the trap. Kurt fired again and again, each shell blasting holes in the tree line, blowing apart dugouts, shredding men hidden behind logs. Dieter's muscles burned, his hands raw from shoving frozen shells into the breach. Sweat ran down his back despite the freezing air. Inside the Panzer, the air was thick with cordite, smoke, and fear. A sudden jolt rocked the Panzer. Another shell had struck. This one punched into the side armor, cracking steel, spraying shrapnel into the cabin. Kurt cried out, his cheek sliced open, blood running down his face. "I'm hit!" he shouted, voice wild. Otto leaned down, grabbing him by the shoulder. "It's nothing. Keep firing!" Kurt's hands shook, but he obeyed, swinging the gun toward another muzzle flash. His shot roared, the recoil slamming him back. "The Soviet gun disappeared in a fireball," Hans growled through clenched teeth. "They're everywhere. We can't hold this." Otto's voice was iron. "We don't hold it. We break through." "Full throttle!" Otto barked. Hans didn't hesitate. He rammed the levers forward, the Panzer surging down the forest track like a bull. Branches snapped, snow erupted, bodies scattered. Bullets ricocheted off the hull. Grenades burst against the skirts. Flames clung to the armor. But the Panzer did not stop. Kurt's gun thundered, cutting swathes through the tree line. Dieter's arms blurred, sweat dripping, his muscles screaming with effort. The forest itself seemed to explode around them. Trees splintered, snow filled the air, fire roared, and then, suddenly, silence. They burst from the tree line into open fields, the forest falling behind them, smoke curling in the distance. Inside the Panzer, the crew sat gasping, their faces pale, their ears ringing. Kurt wiped blood from his cheek, staring blankly at the ruined forest behind them. That wasn't fighting. That was butchery. Hans kept his eyes forward, his voice low. They're not human. They don't stop. They don't break. Dieter slumped against the shells, his chest heaving. Then neither can we. Otto said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the endless fields of snow that stretched ahead. The forest had nearly swallowed them whole, but they had clawed free. For now. That night, they camped on the edge of the field, their panzer hulking in the moonlight, its armor scarred and blackened. The men sat in silence around a small fire, their faces lit by the flames. No one spoke. No one joked. The forest loomed behind them, dark and quiet, a graveyard of men, machines, and shattered trees. Otto finally broke the silence, his voice low. Today we were lucky. Tomorrow we may not be. The others nodded, each man lost in his own thoughts. The Eastern Front had no mercy. The forest had only been the beginning. The weeks after the forest ambush were quiet. Too quiet. The Panzer IV limped across snowbound villages and burned-out fields, its engine coughing in protest, its armor scarred from near misses. The crew carried the silence like a weight. They no longer joked. They no longer argued. They simply endured. But rumors spread among the men. Whispers passed from company to company. The Soviets have a new tank. Sloped armor, thick as a fortress. Not even our 75mm can break it, Kurt scoffed when he first heard it. Every new tank is supposed to be invincible. Until I put a shell through it, Hans only grunted. Keep laughing. You'll see soon enough. Dieter loaded shells in silence, his broad hands moving mechanically. Otto, as always, said nothing, but in his gut, he knew the whispers were true. It came on a gray morning, with the snow falling heavy and wet. The Panzer IV was leading a small column through open farmland when Hans spotted movement on the ridge ahead, dark shapes against the whiteness. Vehicles, Hans muttered. Otto raised his binoculars. His heart clenched. They were tanks, big ones, their hulls low, their turrets wide, their armor sloped like angled shields, their tracks cut through the snow with ease, their engines growling like beasts. T-34s. Contact front, Otto barked. Kurt swung the turret, his breath fogging the sight. Got them. Range? 700 meters. Fire! Dieter slammed a shell into the breach. The gun roared. The shell streaked across the field and bounced. It ricocheted from the sloped armor of the lead T-34, sparking harmlessly away. Scheisse, Kurt whispered. It didn't even scratch it. The T-34s returned fire. Their 76mm cannons barked, shells screaming in. One smashed into the half-track behind the Panzer IV, blowing it apart in a tower of flame. Men flew like rag dolls, their screams lost in the thunder. Another shell slammed into the ground just short of the Panzer, snow and dirt erupting across the hull. The crew ducked instinctively, ears ringing. Hans shouted through the intercom, "We can't fight them head-on." Otto's voice was iron. "Then we flank them. Hard right, move?" Hans rammed the levers, the Panzer lurching off the road into the fields. Snow churned under the treads, mud spraying as they fought for traction. "Loader, AP! Gunner, aim for the sides," Otto barked. The Panzer weaved through the snow, Kurt firing again and again. One shell struck the turret of a T-34, leaving only a scorch mark. Another bounced from the glacis plate like a stone skipping water. "They're monsters!" Kurt shouted, sweat stinging his eyes. "Shut up and keep firing!" Otto snapped. Finally, the chance came. As the T-34s turned to follow, one exposed its side. Otto seized the moment. "There! Left flank! Fire!" Kurt aimed, breath steady despite the chaos. He squeezed the trigger. The shell punched into the T-34's side armor. This time it penetrated. The Soviet tank erupted in a blast of smoke and fire, its turret blown half off, its crew spilling into the snow. "Hit!" Dieter shouted, slamming another shell into the breach, but the others kept coming. 3, 4, 5 of them, spreading out, their guns flashing fire. Shells rained around them. One struck the ground so close that the Panzer lifted on its treads before slamming back down. Another slammed into the side skirt, cracking the steel, the cabin filling with sparks. Hans wrestled the levers, sweat pouring down his face despite the freezing air. "They're faster! I can't outrun them!" Otto leaned forward, eyes blazing. "Then we don't run. We kill them." The Panzer skidded behind a ridge, snow exploding around it. Kurt swung the turret, waiting. The moment the first T-34 crested the ridge, he fired. The shells smashed into its lower hull, piercing clean through. The tank groaned, then burst into flame, black smoke curling into the gray sky. But another T-34 fired back instantly. Its shells struck the Panzer's glasses, rocking the crew violently. The armor held. Barely. "Scheisse, they almost had us," Kurt shouted. Dieter shoved another shell in. "Then shoot faster!" The battle raged across the snowy farmland, fire and smoke tearing the silence. The Panzer IV darted between ridges and fences, using every scrap of cover. Kurt fired until his shoulder ached. His vision blurred from the recoil. Dieter's muscles screamed as he heaved shell after shell. 2 more T-34s fell, their hulks burning in the snow. But still more came. The Soviets did not stop. Hans swore, his voice raw. "It's endless. They've got 100 of them." Otto's jaw clenched. He could feel the truth in his bones. The days of German armor dominance were over. The T-34 had changed the battlefield, and his crew would have to change with it, or die. At last, the order crackled over the radio. "All units, disengage! Pull back, pull back!" Otto wasted no time. "Full throttle, Hans! South now!" The Panzer turned hard, snow spraying, its engine roaring in protest. The T-34s fired after them, shells screaming past, explosions chasing them across the fields. One shell slammed just behind, flipping a cart into splinters. Another tore a crater where they had been seconds before. But the Panzer kept moving, its treads churning, its engine howling like a beast refusing to die. Finally, the gunfire faded. The Soviets held the ridge. The Germans retreated. The day belonged to the T-34s. Inside the Panzer, the crew sat in silence, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. Kurt's hands shook as he cleaned the gun sight. "They're invincible. Nothing stops them." Dieter slumped against the shell rack, his arms limp. "We stopped 2, maybe 3. But there's always more." Hans kept his eyes on the snowy road ahead, his voice low. "We're not hunters anymore. We're prey." Otto said nothing. He stared at the horizon, his jaw tight, his eyes hollow. He had seen the future of the war, and it had a sloped hull and a red star painted on its turret. That night they camped in a frozen orchard, their Panzers scarred and smoking. The men huddled inside, silent, each lost in thought. The legend of German armor superiority had died that day. The T-34 had shown them the truth. The Eastern Front had changed, and so had the war. Otto whispered into the silence, barely loud enough for the others to hear. "We're fighting giants now." No one disagreed. By late autumn, Otto Keller's crew found themselves at the gates of a city that looked less like a place to live and more like a graveyard. What had once been an industrial jewel of the Volga was now a smoldering carcass of rubble, chimneys standing like tombstones, factories gutted by fire. The air stank of ash, blood, and rot. Smoke drifted endlessly, black against the gray winter sky. The Panzer IV crawled through shattered streets, its treads grinding across bricks, glass, and bones. Every corner could hide a sniper, every cellar a nest of grenades. Inside, the crew sat stiff and silent. They had fought forests and fields, but this was something else. A city turned into a battlefield. "A labyrinth of death," Dieter muttered, his voice tight. "I'd rather fight 10 tanks in the open than one street like this." Hans gripped the levers, guiding the Panzer through narrow alleys. "Streets aren't made for tanks. They're made for coffins." Kurt peered through his sight, sweat cold on his skin despite the freezing air. "Better hope Ivan agrees with you." Otto scanned through the cupola, eyes hard. "Stay sharp. The enemy is everywhere." At first, the Germans pushed forward, block by block. Houses were blown apart. Soviets flushed from cellars and sewer lines. The Panzer IV's gun blasted through walls, its machine guns spitting fire into windows. But then November turned to December, and the Red Army struck back. Soviet armies poured across the Volga, surrounding the city in a great steel vise. The German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was trapped. When the news reached Otto's crew, silence filled the Panzer. Kurt broke it first, his voice low. "So, no going home," Hans snorted bitterly. "Home? Home's 1,000 miles west. Out there is nothing but snow and Russians." Dieter looked at Otto, eyes wide. "What now?" Otto didn't answer immediately. He stared through his binoculars at the horizon, where smoke and fire rose in every direction. "We fight," he said at last, "until there's nothing left." The winter came down like a hammer. Temperatures plunged below -30. The Volga froze solid. Winds howled through the ruins, and snow buried the wreckage of men and machines alike. Food vanished. The rations grew smaller each day. A crust of bread, a thin soup made from horse bones. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. Inside the Panzer, the crew sat hollow-eyed. Their breath turned to frost on the steel walls. Their hands cracked from cold. Hans's voice was a whisper. "I dream of food. Not women, not home. Just food." Kurt's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Don't waste your dreams. Dreams won't keep you alive." Dieter hugged his coat tighter, his body trembling. "Neither will this war." Otto listened to them in silence, his jaw tight. He could feel them slipping, not just from hunger and cold, but from despair. The Panzer kept running only because they forced it to. Without it, they were just 4 men waiting to die in the snow. The Red Army struck again and again, waves of men charging through rubble, supported by Katyusha rockets and artillery that never seemed to run out of shells. The Panzer IV became a bunker on tracks, firing from street corners, backing through alleys, blasting holes in walls to escape. Kurt fired until his shoulder ached, shells slamming into Soviet strongpoints, collapsing entire buildings. Dieter's arms trembled from exhaustion as he loaded, sweat freezing on his skin. Hans cursed as he wrestled the levers through streets too narrow for their beast. One day, they knocked out 3 Soviet tanks in a single fight, but nearly lost their own when a T-34 rammed them head-on, its wreck burning only meters away. Another time, Soviet infantry swarmed them with grenades and Molotovs, clambering onto the hull. Dieter fired his pistol out of the loader's hatch. Hans swerved wildly, and Otto ordered Kurt to fire point-blank into a wall to blast them off. The explosion shook the entire street. Each day bled into the next. Each fight blurred into smoke, snow, and blood. In January, the air changed. The Soviet attacks slowed. The shelling became sporadic. The streets fell eerily silent. Hans frowned. "What's going on? Why aren't they hitting us?" Kurt muttered. "Maybe they've given up." Dieter shook his head. "Or maybe they're waiting." Otto knew the truth. He could see it in the empty streets, in the smoldering ruins, in the gray horizon. The Soviets weren't finished. They were tightening the noose, waiting for the right moment to crush the Sixth Army completely. And inside the ring, the Germans were dying without a single shot being fired. Of hunger, of cold, of despair. By February, the once mighty Sixth Army was a shadow. Men staggered through the snow in rags, their faces hollow, their eyes dead. Horses had been eaten, dogs too. Even wallpaper was boiled for its paste. The Panzer IV crew watched it all in silence. Kurt whispered, staring at a column of starving soldiers. "We're already dead." "Just waiting for the bullet," Hans spat on the frozen ground. "Better a bullet than starving like a rat." Dieter closed his eyes, his voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore." Otto looked at them, his crew, his brothers. He saw the despair eating them alive, and he knew what had to be said. "No," Otto said firmly. "We're not dead yet. Not while we still fight. Not while we still breathe. Understand?" They stared at him in silence, and slowly, grudgingly, they nodded, because, in truth, it was all they had left. The Soviets came one final time, their tanks and infantry pouring into the ruins like a flood. The Panzer IV roared back to life, its engine coughing smoke, its gun thundering one last defiance. Kurt fired until the barrel glowed red, until shells ran low, until his shoulder felt broken. Dieter loaded until his arms failed, his hands bleeding. Hans drove through rubble and fire, his body numb with exhaustion. They held a crossroads, buying time for retreating infantry. Shell after shell tore into T-34s, collapsing buildings, scattering Soviet squads. But for every one they killed, 10 more came. The Soviet tide was unstoppable. Inside the Panzer, Otto shouted over the chaos, "This is where we hold! As long as she runs, we fight." The crew answered with silence, not out of fear, but out of grim resolve. By nightfall, the crossroads was lost. The Panzer IV was riddled with holes, its armor cracked, its engine nearly dead. The crew was exhausted, half frozen, half starved, but they were alive. Barely. The Sixth Army would surrender within days. But Otto and his crew, still inside their battered Panzer, had not yet made their choice. By late January, the Sixth Army was collapsing. The Soviets tightened the noose, their artillery pounding day and night, their tanks prowling the ruins like wolves. Inside the German lines, men froze in their foxholes, starved in cellars, or died where they stood. Entire regiments melted away, not from bullets but from hunger and frost. Otto Keller's Panzer IV crew sat huddled inside their steel coffin, breath clouding in the frigid air. The ammunition racks were almost empty. The fuel gauge hovered near nothing. It was Kurt who broke the silence. "They say some are trying to break out," Hans snorted. "Break out where? We're surrounded on every side." "Southwest," Kurt insisted. "Toward Kotelnikovo, toward our own lines." Dieter leaned forward, eyes hollow. "And how many make it?" Kurt didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all knew the truth. Otto listened quietly. His mind was already turning, calculating, weighing the impossible. Finally, he spoke. "If there's even a chance, we take it. Better to die moving than starve here like dogs." The others looked at him, and slowly, they nodded. The decision was made. They spent the next day coaxing life back into their Panzer. Hans and Otto worked in the freezing wind, scraping ice from the engine, patching leaks with wire and rag. Dieter scavenged fuel from wrecked vehicles, siphoning the last drops into their tank. Kurt polished the optics and checked the gun, though they had only a handful of shells left. When it was done, Otto ran his hand along the scarred armor. The Panzer looked more corpse than machine. Its skirts riddled with holes, its paint blackened by fire, its engine coughing with every breath. But it still lived, and so did they. The breakout began under cover of darkness. Dozens of survivors, infantry engineers, stragglers, clung to Otto's Panzer as it rumbled out of the ruins. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken, their bodies wrapped in rags. They looked less like soldiers and more like ghosts. The night was bitter cold. Snow fell in silence, muffling their tracks. Hans whispered into the intercom. "Feels too quiet." "It always does," Otto murmured. "Keep going." They had gone scarcely 5 kilometers when the silence shattered. Machine guns blazed from the tree line, tracers slicing the dark. Mortars whistled overhead, exploding in the snow. Soviet searchlights flicked on, cutting through the night, blinding beams that lit the fleeing column like prey. "Ambush!" Otto roared. Hans swerved, the Panzer lurching through the snow. Kurt swung the turret, his breath sharp, his finger tight on the trigger. "Target front, MG nest." Dieter slammed a shell into the breech. "Up!" The gun roared, the flash blinding in the dark. The Soviet nest vanished in a burst of fire and snow. But more guns opened up, more tracers poured in. Men fell screaming all around them, the infantry scattering in panic. "Forward!" Otto barked. "Don't stop!" Hans jammed the throttle. The Panzer surged through the firestorm, its treads crushing snow and men alike. Kurt fired again and again, each shot tearing holes in the Soviet line. Dieter's arms burned, his hands raw, but he loaded without pause. Soviet infantry swarmed from the trees, their cries piercing the night. Molotovs arced through the air, flames splashing across the hull. Smoke poured into the cabin, choking them. Dieter grabbed the extinguisher, foam spraying. Hans coughed, eyes watering as he fought the levers. "They're everywhere," Kurt shouted. Otto's voice was steel. "Then kill them all." They broke through the tree line, and froze. Ahead, silhouetted against the snow, loomed shapes far larger than men. Dozens of them, tanks, Soviet armor, T-34s and KV-1s, their guns already turning. Kurt's voice cracked. "We can't fight that." "Not with what we have," Hans shouted. "Then what do we do?" Otto's mind raced. They had only seconds before the Soviets opened fire. To stop was death. To turn back was death. He clenched his jaw. "Straight through!" The crew stared at him in shock. "Now!" Otto barked. Hans slammed the throttle. The Panzer lurched forward, its engine howling in defiance. The Soviet guns opened fire. Shells screamed past, explosions ripping the snow around them. One slammed into a fleeing truck, tearing it apart in a blossom of flame. Men scattered, screaming, burning. Kurt fired wildly, his shells striking a T-34 broadside. It staggered, smoke curling from its armor, but kept coming. Dieter slammed another shell in, his hands trembling. "That's the last AP round. Make it count," Otto shouted. Kurt aimed, his breath slow, steady despite the chaos. He fired. The shell punched through the side of a KV-1, the massive tank shuddering before erupting in fire. The explosion lit the night like dawn. The Panzer roared through the gap, its treads tearing across the snow, its crew clinging to survival by sheer will. Hours later, they crawled out of the firestorm. Behind them, the breakout had collapsed. The infantry was gone. Most of the vehicles were burning wrecks. The Sixth Army was finished, but Otto's Panzer still moved. Scarred, smoking, nearly empty of fuel, but alive. Inside, the crew sat in silence, their faces hollow, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Hans finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "We should be dead," Kurt laughed bitterly. "We probably are, just too stubborn to lie down." Dieter leaned back, closing his eyes. "Then let's keep being stubborn." Otto stared ahead, his eyes hard. They hadn't escaped the war. They hadn't even escaped Stalingrad completely, but for tonight, they had escaped death. And that was enough. The breakout from Stalingrad had been no victory, only survival. Otto Keller's Panzer IV limped westward across the frozen steppe, its armor cracked, its paint blackened by fire. Fuel was almost gone, the ammunition racks nearly empty, the engine coughing with every mile. The crew was no better. Hans drove with hollow eyes, his hands raw and cracked from frost. Dieter's lips were blue, his face gaunt from hunger. Kurt's cheek was still bandaged from shrapnel, his laugh sharper, more bitter with every passing day. And Otto. Otto no longer looked like a man, but like the steel machine he commanded. Hard, scarred, and unyielding. Around them trudged columns of infantry. Ragged men in rags, boots wrapped in cloth, their rifles slung but useless. They looked like shadows moving west, swallowed by the endless white horizon. The Sixth Army was dead. These were only its ghosts. Food was gone. The rations had vanished weeks ago. Soldiers gnawed frozen horseflesh, boiled belts for leather soup, even chewed on bark ripped from trees. Inside the Panzer, the crew shared whatever they could scavenge. A crust of bread here, a few frozen potatoes there. Dieter's voice was hoarse as he chewed a scrap of dried meat. "I'd give anything for a proper meal, just one. Sausage, bread, beer," Kurt snorted bitterly. "Dream smaller. Bread alone would be a feast." Hans kept his eyes on the frozen track, his voice low. "Dreams don't fill bellies." Otto said nothing. He had stopped dreaming weeks ago. The landscape stretched endless, white fields, gray skies, black lines of trees. Snowstorms swept across the land, blinding and merciless. The wind cut through clothing, through steel, through bone. Many of the infantry fell on the march. Some collapsed in the snow and never rose again. The living trudged past them without a glance. There was no strength left for mourning. Kurt watched them from the gunner's sight, his face pale. "They're already dead. Just walking corpses," Dieter muttered. "So are we." Hans gripped the levers tighter, his voice sharp. Not yet. They were never alone. Every few days, Soviet aircraft prowled overhead. Il-2 Sturmoviks, the flying tanks of the Red Army. Their engines growled like thunder, their guns spitting fire into the retreating columns. Whenever they appeared, panic tore through the men. Trucks scattered, horses bolted, soldiers threw themselves into ditches. The Panzer IV fought back when it could, its machine guns snapping skyward, tracers flashing in the gray. But it was useless. The Il-2s swooped low, their cannons tearing through armor, their bombs scattering men like straw. One afternoon, a Sturmovik dived straight at them, its rockets streaking fire. Hans swerved violently, the Panzer lurching across the snow. The rockets slammed into the ground behind them, flipping a truck into a ball of flame. Kurt cursed, slamming his fist against the gun sight. "We can't fight the sky. We can't fight anything anymore." Otto's voice was steady but hollow. "Then we keep moving." It wasn't just planes. Soviet tanks stalked them too. One night, as the Panzer crept through a ruined village, headlights flared in the distance. Dark shapes rolled into view, T-34s, their turrets already turning. Hans froze. "Not again." Otto's jaw tightened. "Reverse. Into cover." The Panzer backed into a collapsed barn, hiding in the shadows. The T-34s rumbled past, their engines echoing through the ruins. The crew held their breath, silent as the dead. For 10 minutes, they sat in darkness, listening to the enemy pass, hearts pounding, sweat freezing on their skin. When the sound faded, Kurt exhaled shakily. "We're not fighting anymore. We're just running." Dieter's voice was a whisper. "Maybe that's all that's left." Days blurred into nights, nights into days. Time lost meaning. One evening, the Panzer stopped near a burned farmhouse. Inside, they found a Russian family, a mother and 2 children, huddled in the cellar, their faces pale with hunger. The crew stared at them in silence. The mother clutched her children, expecting the worst. Dieter knelt, pulling a small crust of bread from his pocket. He handed it to the children. Kurt stared at him in disbelief. "That was your last piece." Dieter shrugged, his voice quiet. "They need it more than I do." For a moment the war fell away. There was only the silence of the cellar, the children chewing hungrily, the mothers whispered thanks in broken German. When they left, Otto glanced back once. The family waved weakly from the doorway. Hans muttered, "You know they'll starve anyway." Otto answered softly, "Maybe, but not tonight." The retreat dragged on, each day a battle against the cold, against hunger, against despair. The Panzer IV became their coffin on tracks, carrying them mile after mile through the frozen wasteland. Its engine was failing, its armor riddled, its fuel nearly gone. Inside, the men barely spoke anymore. Words had lost meaning. Only survival mattered. Kurt stared through the sight, whispering to himself, "I used to believe we were the hunters. Now we're just animals in the snow," Hans muttered. "Then we run like animals, until there's nothing left." Otto sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew the truth. They were not escaping. They were only delaying the inevitable. One night, a blizzard struck. The wind howled like demons, snow burying the world, erasing the road. Visibility dropped to nothing. Hans could barely see the ground in front of the Panzer. The treads slipped, the engine screamed, the cold cut into their bones. They stopped in the ruins of a barn. The walls half collapsed, the roof caved in. Inside they lit a tiny fire, huddling together for warmth. No one spoke. The silence was thicker than the snow. Kurt finally broke it, his voice little more than a whisper. "How much longer can we keep this up?" Dieter didn't answer. Hans closed his eyes. Otto stared into the flames, his face like stone. They all knew the answer. Not long. When dawn came, the blizzard had buried half the Panzer in snow. They dug it free with frozen hands, their bodies trembling, their faces numb. The engine coughed, groaned. then roared reluctantly back to life. The Panzer crawled westward once more, a scarred beast dragging its crew toward a horizon that promised nothing but more cold, more hunger, more death. But still, they moved, because to stop was to die. By February 1943, the retreat had become a rout. German columns straggled west across the frozen steppe, harried at every turn by Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Men collapsed in the snow by the thousands, too weak to rise. Horses froze in their traces. Vehicles broke down and were left burning on the roadside. Otto Keller's Panzer IV was a ghost of a machine, its skirts shredded, its hull scarred, its engine barely alive. Inside, the crew looked no better. Hans's face was sunken, his lips cracked and bleeding. Kurt's eyes were hollow, haunted, his cheek scar still raw. Dieter's hands were blistered, his frame gaunt from hunger. And Otto himself, his hair now more gray than black, his face drawn tight. He had become less man than shadow, carried forward by sheer stubbornness. The Panzer crawled through a ruined village, smoke rising from chimneys looted days earlier, the snow-stained red where battles had raged. It was there the order came down. Hold the line. A messenger on horseback, wrapped in rags, delivered the command. A Soviet armored column was pursuing, and the retreating Germans needed time. Otto's Panzer, along with a handful of stragglers, would stay behind to ambush the enemy. Hans spat into the snow. "They're sending us to die." Kurt gave a hollow laugh. "We were dead the moment we crossed into Russia." Dieter looked at Otto, his voice shaking. "What do you say, Sergeant?" Otto stared at the horizon, where the gray sky met the endless white steppe. He knew the truth. It was a death sentence, but he also knew there was no choice. Someone had to buy time. He met their eyes, one by one. "This is it. We fight here. One last time." No one argued. They positioned the Panzer in a narrow gully lined with skeletal trees. The ground was firm enough for treads but soft enough to absorb shock, the perfect place for an ambush. Dieter stacked their last shells carefully, counting them aloud. 8 armor-piercing, 5 high-explosive. "That's all we've got." Kurt nodded grimly, adjusting the gun sight. "Then we make every shot count." Hans checked the levers, his breath clouding in the cold. "If the engine stalls, we're finished." Otto climbed into the cupola, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. Smoke plumes marked the approaching Soviets. Tanks, trucks, infantry, a tide of steel rolling west. He lowered the glasses and muttered, "It's time." The first Soviet vehicles appeared as shadows against the snow, trucks laden with infantry. Behind them, T-34s and KV-1s, their guns sweeping the horizon. Otto raised his fist, then dropped it. "Fire!" Kurt squeezed the trigger. The 75mm barked. The lead truck exploded. Men hurled screaming into the snow. Chaos rippled through the column. "Reload!" Otto barked. Dieter slammed another shell into the breach. "Up!" Kurt fired again. Another truck burst apart in fire and steel. Soviet infantry scattered, shouting, diving into the snow. The ambush had begun. The T-34s advanced, their guns flashing. Shells screamed into the gully, snow and dirt exploding around the Panzer. One struck close, rocking the tank violently. Another ricocheted off the glasses, sparks showering inside. "Target left!" "T-34!" Otto shouted. Kurt aimed, his hands steady despite the thunder. He fired. The shell punched into the Soviet side armor, flames bursting from its hatches. The crew bailed, screaming as they burned. "Hit!" Dieter shouted, already shoving another shell in. Another T-34 rumbled forward, guns blazing. Hans swerved the Panzer, the shell missing by meters. Kurt fired again. Another hit. Another Soviet tank burning in the snow. But they were too many. For every one they destroyed, 3 more rolled forward. The Soviets poured into the gully, infantry swarming alongside their tanks. Machine guns rattled, grenades arced through the air. A Molotov shattered against the Panzer's hull, flames licking the armor. Smoke filled the cabin. Dieter grabbed the extinguisher, spraying foam, coughing violently. Hans wrestled the levers, shouting, "They're closing in!" Otto's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep firing! "We hold until the last shell." Kurt obeyed, firing again and again, his body shaking from the recoil. Dieter loaded until his hands bled. Hans drove like a madman, weaving the Panzer through smoke and fire. The Soviets closed like wolves, their shouts echoing through the gully. At last, Dieter's voice broke through the chaos. "Empty! That's the last one!" Kurt fired. The final shell streaked across the snow, smashing into a KV-1, flames bursting from its turret. The massive tank groaned, then toppled sideways into the snow. And then, silence. The gun was empty. The Panzer was blind. The Soviets circled, their guns trained, their infantry swarming closer. Inside, the crew sat in silence, their breaths heavy, their faces pale. Hans whispered, "This is it." Kurt gave a bitter laugh. "Not bad for a last stand." Dieter closed his eyes, muttering a prayer. Otto looked at them all, his brothers, his family in steel, and nodded once. "Then we make it count." Hans rammed the throttle forward. The Panzer lurched out of the gully, charging headlong into the Soviet column. Bullets and shells hammered the armor, sparks flying, steel cracking. Flames licked the hull. Smoke poured from the engine. The Panzer roared like a dying beast, plowing through infantry, crushing men beneath its treads, slamming into a T-34 with a thunderous crash. For one glorious moment, it seemed unstoppable. Then the world erupted. A Soviet shell struck the Panzer broadside. The armor split. Fire engulfed the cabin. The crew screamed as heat and smoke consumed them. When the smoke cleared, the Panzer IV was nothing but a blackened hulk. Its turret twisted, its treads broken. Around it, the battlefield was littered with wrecks, trucks burning, Soviet tanks smoking, bodies strewn across the snow. The ambush had cost the enemy dearly, but the Panzer IV would fight no more. Inside, the crew lay still, their final stand complete. Days later, German survivors whispered of the Panzer that had held the Soviets for hours, buying precious time for retreat. They spoke of a crew who refused to surrender, who fought until the last shell, who turned a machine into a legend. The Soviets, too, remembered it. The ghostly Panzer that ambushed them in the gully, leaving wrecks burning in the snow. And though Otto Keller and his men never returned, their story lived on, not as heroes, not as villains, but as soldiers swallowed by the furnace of the Eastern Front.